Okay, let's unpack this. When we think about democracy, um, our minds usually go straight to voting, right? Electing representatives, political parties, maybe systems of government.
Yeah, it's all about the external structure, isn't it?
Exactly. The stuff we set up rules, procedures, institutions, and we kind of hope they lead to a society that works well.
That's the common picture, absolutely.
Yeah.
The polls, the legislature, checks and balances. It's the machinery of the state, basically, how we usually see it.
Yeah.
Designed to manage big groups of people.
But, despite all our efforts trying to perfect this machinery, why do democracies, especially looking back, seem to stumble so often? Why do we still see these persistent problems like corruption, division, that feeling the system isn't really representing the people?
It's a question that really does echo through history, doesn't it? We keep trying different external fixes, tweaking the system, but the underlying issues just seem to, well, they keep popping back up.
So what if the fundamental problem isn't actually in the external system at all? What if real democracy is something, well, far more fundamental, something deeply personal that maybe we've completely overlooked?
That's quite a thought.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a truly unique and frankly pretty radical perspective. It's from Harold W. Percival's book, Democracy as Self-Government.
Right. And our mission here, just drawing from this source, is to really explore Percival's core idea that genuine democracy isn't primarily about governing others or even being governed by them, but it's fundamentally about individual self-government. We're going to pull out the key ideas he uses to build this case, sticking just to what's in the text.
And here's where it gets really fascinating, I think. Percival's view connects the inner state of the individual, like their consciousness, their thoughts, their behavior, directly to the health, even the fate of entire nations and civilizations. Yeah, it completely flips the script. It suggests the external political form we see is actually just an effect, an outcome of the internal state of the people.
Yeah. So it's less about fixing the system out there,
right,
and more about understanding and maybe transforming what's happening in here, inside each person.
Exactly. So let's start with the foundation of his whole argument. What does he even mean by the self in self-government? Percival's central idea is really clear, deceptively simple. Democracy is self-government. But he's definitely not talking about the everyday personality or the ego we usually think of as me.
No, not at all. He uses a very specific term, the conscious doer. He says this isn't the physical body, it's not the personality. It's an immortal, conscious entity that's present in every single human body.
Okay.
This doer is the conscious I that experiences life, the part that says, I think, I feel, I want. It's the part that's aware.
And this doer, he says, is actually just one piece of a bigger picture, right? A larger immortal entity he calls the Triune Self.
That's right. Like a complete true self made up of three parts.
Yeah.
His doer plus the thinker and the knower.
But the doer right now isn't quite fully aware of this.
Exactly. The source describes the doer's current state as being, well, hypnotized or controlled, really, by the body's senses. It mistakenly thinks it is the body it lives in, living in what the text calls a hypnotic dream, having forgotten where it truly comes from, its real nature. It's kind of enslaved by the body's needs and what nature dictates.
Okay, so if the conscious doers in all of us are fundamentally the same, same origin, same purpose, same destiny, as he puts it, then Percival argues that a real democracy is the only form of government that actually gives these doers the chance to wake up to this truth and, fulfill that destiny.
And that leads straight to the absolute key requirement for such a democracy. The doers, basically the people, have to become self-governed by the conscious power of rightness and reason from within.
From within.
Yes. It's an internal transformation that has to happen before the external reality of a true democracy can even exist.
Which brings us right back to that first problem. Why have past attempts at democracy seemed to fail so often? According to Percival, it's precisely because the people weren't self-governed internally.
Yeah, he puts it pretty bluntly. He says it's because people were eager for their own rights, but crucially, refused to consider or allow rights to others. They wanted rights and advantages without responsibilities.
Yeah.
This focus on self-interest, what's in it for me, rather than internal self-governance, it blinded them, made them vulnerable.
Vulnerable how?
Vulnerable to being charmed or, manipulated by astute and power-loving pretenders, as he calls them. Demagogues, basically. People who'd promise them anything to get votes.
Right.
Only to later betray those promises and use compulsion or force. The people's lack of internal order just got mirrored in the external disorder of the state.
That makes sense. So he then takes these common words, we use freedom, liberty, equality, and gives them really specific meanings rooted in this internal self idea. Let's start with freedom. He says it's unattachment. Unattachment. What does that actually look like?
Well, he describes it as a mental attitude.
Hmm.
It's independent of what you own or your position in life.
Okay.
It comes from acting out of a sense of duty, following your inner feeling of what's right, rather than being pushed around by wanting rewards or being scared of consequences.
So you could technically be free even if you have nothing.
Exactly. If your mind isn't enslaved by wanting things or fearing you'll lose them.
That's a very different take on freedom than just doing whatever I want. What about liberty then?
Liberty he defines as immunity from slavery. Specifically, the right to do as you please, provided you don't interfere with anyone else's equal right and choice.
There's the catch.
Yes, the text really hammers this home. Liberty demands respect for others' rights. You can't claim liberty for yourself if you're using it to trample on the equal rights of somebody else.
Okay, and then there's equality, another huge term. Percival is pretty direct here too, isn't
Oh,
he?
yeah. He states flat out that equality of people is a misnomer and a fable without sense or reason. His point is, just look around. People are obviously not the same in body or character or intellect. Trying to force some kind of artificial sameness is, in his view, absurd and actually unjust.
So what does he mean by equal rights then, if not sameness?
True equal rights and freedom, according to him, means every single person has the right to think, feel, do, and be whatever they choose,
Okay.
without being forced, pressured, or restrained by others. But, and this is the crucial boundary again, you can't take over or violate someone else's rights without basically canceling out your own claim to those same rights.
So it's about equal opportunity to be yourself as long as you don't impose on others.
Exactly. Equal opportunity to pursue your own path within those bounds of respecting others.
This leads him to this interesting idea of self-determined classes, or maybe orders of people. Bodymen, traders, thinkers, and knowers. He links them to laborers, desire-focused people, thinking-focused, and knowledge-focused.
Right, but crucially, he insists this isn't about your birth or social status or race or how much money you have.
No, so what determines your class?
It's determined entirely, he says, by your own thinking and feeling. It's about your dominant internal state, what you focus on most. The text even gives a kind of law for it. You are as you have thought and felt. Think and feel as you want to be. You will be as you think and feel. Each of these classes or types is necessary for society, he says, and if you injure one, you harm the whole system.
So the insight here is that society's structure isn't just imposed from outside.
No.
It's actually a reflection of the collective internal choices and focuses of everyone in it.
Precisely. Which connects directly to this really powerful idea he has about thought itself. For him, it's not just some abstract mental activity floating around.
Right, he sees it as much more concrete.
Oh, incredibly so. He says, a thought is a thing, a being of power. He explains that thoughts are like conceived in the heart, they're born through the brain, and then they get exteriorized.
Secure.
Yeah, made manifest, turned into all physical reality. Every act, every object, every event, governments, entire civilizations, they all start as thoughts. And things only keep existing as long as we, the doers, keep maintaining the thoughts that correspond to them.
Wait, so the political systems, the buildings we see, the wars, the peace treaties, these are literally manifestations of our collective thoughts.
That's the radical implication, yeah. The external world is essentially a mirror reflecting the internal state of humanity's thinking and feeling.
Wow, okay.
And woven into this power of thought is his concept of justice and eternal law. Percival is adamant that eternal law and justice rule the world, whether we realize it or not.
And justice isn't just legal courts for him.
No, it's much deeper. It's the action of knowledge in relation to the subject. Basically, you give and you receive exactly according to what one has prescribed for himself by his thoughts and acts. Karma, essentially, but very precisely defined.
So the unexpected stuff that happens to us, good or bad, the consequences we face, he attributes these to what he calls officers of justice in the world of the unseen.
Yes, which the source later links to the thinkers, that second part of the Triune Self we mentioned. It's like a higher aspect of your own total self acting as a kind of judge and administrator, bringing the natural results of your own past thoughts and actions back to you.
And how do we, as these doers sort of stuck identifying with the body, how do we learn about this eternal law so we can maybe live in harmony with it?
Percival points to an internal guide. He says there's a station in every human body where this is possible. It's located in the heart.
The heart. You mean conscience.
Exactly. The voice of conscience. He defines it as the doer's own standard of right. It's your immediate sum of knowledge on any moral question. The really crucial task, then, is learning to tell the difference between that genuine voice of conscience, your own inner standard of right, and all the noise from sensory preferences, ingrained prejudices, bodily desires, all the stuff that often pretends to be inner guidance. And then, of course, learning to actually heed that conscience.
This internal state, this self-governance idea, it must also deeply affect how we approach work and ownership, right?
Yeah.
Which are pretty core to any society.
Absolutely. Percival talks about purpose and work. Having a purpose gives you direction, obviously, and work is just the action you take to achieve that purpose.
And if you don't have a purpose?
Then, he says, you risk becoming just a tool for others who do have a purpose. He also highlights how our mental attitude towards work totally changes the experience, drudgery versus play.
Right. He even mentions that Mark Twain story.
Yeah, the Tom Sawyer whitewashing the fence anecdote. It perfectly illustrates how just shifting your perception, your inner viewpoint, can transform labor into something desirable.
It really does. And he stresses the honor in honest, useful work, right? And warns against trying to get something for nothing.
Yes, he sees that desire as the start of dishonesty. It leads down a path of deceit, speculation, gambling, crime. It's basically an attempt to cheat that law of compensation, that justice we talked about.
And his view on ownership is also, well, pretty unconventional.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He states you can't really own anything in this physical world except the portion of your own feeling and desire that you brought with you into this life.
Wait, really? What about my house, my car?
Nope. Possessions, he says, are only for use. Their real value lies in how you use them, not in the piece of paper that says you own them.
How does that connect to his other ideas?
It ties right into his concept of the human body being nature's house of bondage. While the doer is in this state, kind of identifying with the body, it's essentially a slave to nature's needs and cycles. And while we're in this state, he says, we fool ourselves into thinking we own things that actually belong to nature. Things that are temporary, that can be swept away by external events, wars, economic panics, natural disasters, you name it.
Right.
So true freedom from attachment to possessions doesn't come from getting more stuff, but through self-control and self-government over our desire for that stuff.
Okay, that's a challenge. He then applies this internal-external dynamic to capital, labor, and money. How does he define capital? It's not just cash, is it?
No, not at all. Capital, for him, includes 4 essential things every worker possesses. Head capital, which is knowledge. Hand capital, meaning skill and effort. Time capital, obviously. And intelligence capital. Labor is just the physical or mental toil involved in using that capital.
So capital and labor aren't necessarily opposed.
Not fundamentally, no. He sees them as complementary, totally necessary for each other. To get along and both profit, they need to move past what he calls stupid selfishness and actually consider each other's interests. Harmony in the economy, just like in society, needs that mutual consideration, which itself has to be rooted in an internal sense of fairness or rightness.
And what about money in all this?
Money. He asserts money is merely a medium of exchange. It is not true capital, like your brain power, your skills, your time, your intelligence.
And he thinks we've got it wrong.
Very wrong. His critique here is really sharp. Money, he argues, has been allowed to play this abnormal, false, and unfair part, acting as if it were capital itself. It's become the master of business. And this, he says, causes widespread disorder and crime. He even calls it money mania. This obsession with a mere medium of exchange, instead of focusing on true value like character, skill, time, it distorts everything.
So instead of money being the foundation.
Character should be. Character founded on honesty and truthfulness should be the real basis and strength of business. Even credit, he suggests, should depend primarily on someone's character, not just how much money they have access to.
That would change things.
Wouldn't it? The source even floats the idea of a government money department. The goal would be to put money back in its proper place as just a tool, reduce crime and bankruptcy, and get business and government aligned through a shared interest in integrity. The core idea is always that for real democracy to work, internal qualities like character have to be valued above external markers like money.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into some of the more philosophical ideas underpinning all this. Percival talks about the journey of this conscious doer, including what happens after the physical body dies.
Right. He introduces the idea of periodic deaths and reexistence. It's not exactly reincarnation as commonly understood, but similar. The conscious doer and something he calls the breath form.
Breath form.
Yeah, he identifies this as the soul and indestructible unit, but it's distinct from the conscious doer itself. These two leave the physical body at death.
Okay, then what?
The breath form, he says, prepares a new physical body for the next life, and the doer, which is essentially feeling and desire, enters that new body later. This cycle repeats.
Until
Until the doer consciously chooses to break the cycle, transform its body into a perfect and immortal one, and become consciously immortal. So this larger cosmic context frames the whole purpose of having a life in a body. It's an opportunity for the doer to wake up and achieve this conscious immortality, primarily through self-government.
That perspective definitely puts a different spin on things, and it really shapes his view on education, doesn't it? He makes a sharp distinction between schooling and education.
A very sharp distinction.
Yeah.
Schooling, as he sees it, mainly trains the senses and relies heavily on memorization. He thinks it often actually hinders originality and self-reliance by making people dependent on external authorities and information, rather than encouraging them to tap into their own inherent knowledge.
Okay, so what's education then, in his view?
Education is about drawing out that inherent knowledge he believes is latent within the doer. It's about helping the doer connect with the thinker and knower, those higher parts of the Triune Self. He even suggests that schooling should ideally start only after this process of true internal education has begun.
He mentions how kids ask those big questions.
Exactly. Who am I? Where did I come from? He says those questions show the doer trying to understand its situation. And if they get brushed off or given false answers, the doer can kind of retreat and learn to distrust its own inner promptings.
And this inherent knowledge is connected to something he calls the conscious light, which he equates with truth.
Yes, this light, he says, shows things as they are. It comes from those higher parts, the knower and thinker. It's the light of pure intelligence.
And thinking, real thinking for him is what?
It's the steady holding of the conscious light on the subject, like focusing a beam.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a key insight. He believed that by persistently thinking on itself, by directing this conscious light inward, it can actually wake the doer from its hypnotic dream in the body. This light is conscious itself, he says, and it's independent of the physical body or nature's senses.
Which brings us back full circle to that core problem. He identified the doer being hypnotized by the senses.
Right. He says the doer is constantly controlled by suggestions coming through the senses. He gives a very modern-sounding example. Advertising. He calls it the advertising hypnotizer.
Ah, I can see that.
He says advertising uses every artifice and seductive device imaginable to appeal directly to our weaknesses. Vanity, envy, greed, lust, you name it. This compels people to think with what he calls the body mind, that part of us obsessed with getting things for the senses. It makes people believe they're acting out of their own free will, when in reality they're being manipulated through their attachments to sensory desires.
So this inability to separate oneself from the body and senses is why the doer, in its current state, can't really know right and justice clearly, and why it's so easily fooled even if it means well.
Precisely. And that's why self-government, governing those desires, those sense-driven impulses, is so fundamental.
Okay. So finally, Percival brings all these individual, internal concepts to bear on the big picture. Civilization, conflict, the fate of nations.
Yes, he argues that historical civilizations have ultimately failed, not just because of external enemies, but because of an inward barbarity, a lack of that internal self-governance, hidden beneath a thin outward veneer or gloss of culture. And the evidence for this inner failure, he says, is persistent crime and war. Civilizations were built on murder and bloodshed and subjugation.
He frames the conflicts we see in the world quite starkly.
He does. Not just politically, but fundamentally, as a battle between the moral power of democracy, which for him means self-government and rightness, and the brute force of destructionism, which is based on self-interest, desire, and forcing others.
And he says brute force has to be met with force initially.
Yes, he acknowledges that brute force must often be conquered by force as a first step. But, and this is critical, genuine, lasting peace requires both the conquered and the conquerors to become self-governed internally. A true war to stop war, he argues, can only be fought successfully by self-conquered people. People who have first established order within themselves.
That's a high bar. He specifically mentions the United States in this context, right?
Yeah.
As having a unique opportunity.
He does. He sees the U.S. as having this special potential to establish real democracy, real civilization, because of its founding ideals. But he immediately stresses that this potential depends entirely on whether the people actually become self-governed. He calls the Constitution a great experiment, basically an opportunity, but absolutely not a guarantee.
And he talks about an old way versus a new way of relating.
Yeah, the old way is conflict, competition, the one or the few against the many, or the many against the one or the few. Standard power struggles.
Right.
The new way, he envisions, is cooperation based on understanding. The one or the few for the many, and the many for each one and for all. But this new way, he insists, requires that inner understanding, that connection to truth. It can't be forced on people by external laws or power.
So ultimately, Percival puts the responsibility squarely back on us, the people.
Absolutely. Squarely on the shoulders of the people. He says we are responsible for the quality of our government and our businesses because, well, politicians and governments are just our representatives. They reflect us.
And why do people get deceived, according to him?
It's not because politicians are just inherently bad, he argues. It's because the people themselves lack self-control. They get charmed by promises, they hold on to prejudices and preferences, and crucially, they want that something for nothing.
So the solution isn't really about waiting for better leaders or a better system to magically appear.
No, the solution is internal. He frames the personal practice of self-control and self-government as the most important thing any individual can do. He calls it the game of your life, the fight of your life.
Yeah.
Even the royal sport.
The royal sport.
Yeah, meaning it requires a kind of nobility of character. It's not about conquering other people, but conquering yourself, bringing your feelings and desires, all those appetites, emotions, prejudices, passions, under the conscious control of your own inner sense of rightness and reason. This inner struggle, this fight for agreement within yourself, that's what builds true, lasting character, he believes.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Percival's core message, drawing just from the source material we've looked at, seems to be this. For true democracy, or really any lasting, worthwhile civilization to flourish, it has to be founded not mainly on external systems, rules, or structures, but on the principle and the actual practice of individual self-government, where each conscious doer learns to control their own feelings and desires using rightness and reason that comes from within.
Exactly. The external government, in his view, will just inevitably mirror the internal state, the level of self-governance, or the lack of it present in the individuals who make up the people.
Which leaves us with this final thought from Harold W. Percival, kind of a challenge, really, to each of us listening. Each human being is a government in himself, of whatever kind, by his feelings and desires and his thinking.
So the question becomes, what kind of government are you?